You have 1 week to move out. My brother smirked across the dinner table. My parents stayed silent. I calmly pulled out the property records and said, actually, you have 24 hours. Their faces went pale as they finally read the name on the deed. Hello, everyone. My name is Abigail Turner. I'm 35 years old, and the night my family tried to throw me out of my own house began with my younger brother raising his glass and smiling like he'd already won. You have 1 week to move out. He said it so casually, as if he were reminding me to take out the trash. Mom continued eating. Dad quietly stared at his plate. Neither of them corrected him. Neither of them looked surprised. I slowly set my fork down, looked around the table, then smiled. Is that so? My brother leaned back in his chair. Mom and Dad need the house. And when they're gone, it's mine. I reached into my purse, pulled out a thin brown envelope, placed it carefully beside my dinner plate, then quietly replied, actually, you all have 24 hours. 3 forks hit the table at exactly the same moment. Looking back, that dinner had been years in the making. I grew up in the old white farmhouse, at the edge of Cedar Ridge. It wasn't fancy. The floors creaked. The porch leaned slightly to one side. The roof always needed another repair. But it was home. More importantly, it had belonged to my grandparents. Grandpa Henry built most of it with his own hands. Every summer, he taught me how to repair fences, plant tomatoes, replace loose floorboards. Grandma Eleanor taught me how to bake bread in the old kitchen. She always smiled and said, "A house remembers the people who care for it." I believed her. When I was 21, Grandpa passed away. Grandma followed 4 years later. After the funeral, Mom and Dad moved into the farmhouse permanently. I never questioned it. Neither did anyone else. Everyone simply assumed the house belonged to my parents now, including me. After college, I became a civil engineer. My work often required long hours. Whenever something broke at the farmhouse, I paid to fix it. New roof, water heater, electrical wiring. Not because anyone asked, because I loved the house. Dad always promised, "We'll settle everything someday." I never asked what that meant. Then there was my younger brother, Ryan. Ryan had a gift. He could make every bad decision sound temporary. Lost another job. It wasn't the right fit. Missed another rent payment. My landlord's unreasonable. Borrowed money again. I'll pay everyone back. Mom believed every word. Dad usually stayed quiet. By the time Ryan turned 30, he'd lived in 6 different apartments. Meanwhile, I'd quietly continued helping with the farmhouse, property taxes, insurance, emergency repairs. I never kept score. Family wasn't supposed to. At least, that's what I believed. Things started changing after Dad retired. Ryan suddenly visited much more often. He began talking about keeping the property in the family. Every conversation somehow ended with him living there someday. One afternoon, I overheard Mom, "Ryan deserves a fresh start." Dad nodded slowly. The house would help. I remember asking, "What about me?" Mom looked genuinely confused. "You have a career." As if that answered the question. Several weeks later, Ryan asked for a tour of the basement. He measured rooms, took pictures, talked about renovations. When I asked why, he laughed, planning ahead. Something about his confidence unsettled me. A few days afterward, I stopped by the county records office, not because I expected anything dramatic. I simply wanted copies of old building permits for some renovation work. While searching the property file, the clerk frowned. "Would you like the complete ownership history?" "Sure." She disappeared for several minutes, then returned carrying several documents. As I read the first page, my heart nearly stopped. The registered owner listed on the current deed wasn't my father, wasn't my mother, it wasn't Ryan either. I quietly asked, "Can I have certified copies?" The clerk smiled. "Of course." I walked out carrying a sealed envelope. For 3 days, I said nothing. I needed answers first. That Sunday, Mom insisted on a family dinner. "We need to discuss the future." I already knew what that meant. The dining room looked exactly like it had every Sunday for years. Roast chicken, mashed potatoes, Grandma's old china. Ryan looked unusually cheerful. Halfway through dinner, he finally cleared his throat. "So, I've been thinking." Dad quietly nodded. Mom smiled. Ryan looked directly at me. "You have 1 week to move out." Silence. He continued, "I'll be moving into the farmhouse." Mom calmly added, "It just makes sense." Dad still didn't speak. I quietly asked, "Who decided that?" Mom answered immediately, "We did, and no one thought to ask me." Ryan laughed. "Why would we? It's not your house." For several long seconds, nobody moved. Then, I reached into my purse, pulled out the sealed envelope, placed it on the table. Ryan smirked. "What's that?" "Property records." He laughed louder. "You think paperwork changes anything?" I looked him directly in the eyes. It usually does. Dad finally looked interested. What property records? I slid the certified copies across the table. No one touched them, so I quietly opened the envelope myself, placed the first page where everyone could see it, then calmly said, "Actually, you have 24 hours. Mom frowned. "What are you talking about?" I tapped one line on the document. "The legal owner has requested vacant possession." Ryan burst into laughter. "And who exactly is that?" I looked down at the page one last time, then slowly looked back up. "My name." The room fell completely silent. Ryan's smile disappeared. Dad reached for the paperwork with shaking hands. Mom whispered, "No, that can't be right." Sometimes, families spend years believing a story simply because no one ever questions it. As my father unfolded the certified deed, and Ryan's confident smile began to fade, I realized the truth my grandparents had left behind was finally about to come out. Dad picked up the certified property records with trembling hands. Ryan leaned over his shoulder. Mom stood frozen beside the dining table. For nearly a minute, nobody spoke. Finally, Dad whispered, "It's real." Ryan grabbed the papers. "This has to be fake." "It isn't." He flipped through every page. The county seal, the recording number, the signatures, everything was official. Then he looked at me. "How?" I quietly folded my hands. "When Grandpa became sick, he met with an attorney." Mom shook her head. "He never told us." "No, he didn't." Dad looked confused. "Why would he leave the farmhouse to you?" I took a slow breath. "Because he knew who was taking care of it." The memories came rushing back. Every weekend spent repairing fences, every tax payment, every emergency repair, every winter storm, every summer spent repainting the porch. Grandpa had noticed, even when I believed no one else had. Dad lowered his head. I thought the house automatically became ours. So did I. I never questioned it either." Ryan slammed the papers onto the table. "This isn't fair." I looked at him calmly. "What isn't fair?" "I've been planning to live here." I nodded. "I know. You measured the rooms. You talked about renovations. You made plans." He crossed his arms. "You knew?" I suspected. Mom suddenly spoke. "So you're really throwing us out?" I answered quietly, "No. You tried to throw me out. You gave me 1 week. I'm giving you 24 hours, because you already decided I didn't belong." The words hung heavily in the room. Dad rubbed his face. "I never wanted this to happen." I looked at him sadly. "But you let it happen." He couldn't argue, because it was true. For years, he had stayed silent, and silence had slowly become agreement. Ryan looked desperate. "We're family." "I know. So family doesn't evict each other." I met his eyes. Family also doesn't secretly take someone else's home. No one had an answer. The next morning, Dad called, "Can we meet?" We sat together on the farmhouse porch, the same porch Grandpa had built decades earlier. Dad stared across the fields. "I found Grandpa's old safe last night." He handed me a faded envelope. Across the front, in Grandpa's handwriting, were 4 simple words: "For Abigail when needed." My hands shook as I opened it. Inside was a letter. "Abby, if you're reading this, then something has gone differently than I hoped. This house isn't just lumber and land. It's the place where our family learned what love and hard work look like. I've watched who repaired it without being asked, who paid for what no one else noticed, who loved this home instead of simply expecting to inherit it. That's why the deed is yours. Not because I loved anyone else less, but because I trusted you to protect what this family built." By the time I reached the last line, I couldn't see the words anymore. Dad quietly wiped away his own tears. "I never knew. I don't think Grandpa wanted you to." He nodded. "He was afraid we'd argue." He was right. Over the next 2 days, Mom and Dad packed their belongings. Ryan argued, complained, threatened to challenge the deed, until an attorney reviewed the documents. Everything had been executed properly years earlier. The ownership transfer was completely valid. There was nothing to challenge. As they loaded the last boxes into a moving truck, Dad walked over to me. "I don't expect forgiveness." I stayed quiet, "But I hope someday you'll let your mother and me visit." I looked at the old farmhouse, then back at him. "I won't lock you out, but from now on, you'll call before coming." He nodded. "That's fair." Ryan approached last. He looked embarrassed. "I spent years believing this place was already mine." "I know. I never thanked you. Wasn't for everything you did. It would have been nice." He gave a small, sad smile. "I'll do better." "I hope you do." Epilogue: 3 years have passed. The farmhouse still stands. The porch no longer leans. The old barn has a new roof. Grandma's garden blooms every spring. I still bake her bread every Sunday. Dad and Mom visit often, always after calling first. Sometimes, Dad and I repair fences together. Ryan eventually found a steady job. He bought a small house of his own. The first thing he told me after signing the papers was, "This one will mean more because I earned it." I smiled. I think Grandpa would have liked hearing that. Every Thanksgiving, our family gathers at the farmhouse, not because anyone owns it, but because everyone finally understands what Grandpa was trying to protect. It was never just a house. It was respect. My thoughts. Looking back, the deed didn't change who owned the farmhouse. It revealed who had truly been caring for it all along. Inheritance isn't always about blood. Sometimes it's about responsibility. Sometimes it's about trust. And sometimes, the greatest gift an older generation can leave behind isn't property. It's the confidence that they chose the right person to protect what mattered most. A home isn't defined by whose name is on the deed. It's defined by the people who treat it, and the people inside it, with love, respect, and care.